So to get us started, I'm going to take you out here to one of our SharePoint environments, and we're just going to look at a library, right? I mentioned a couple of things there that you might want to get some pretty quick value out of yourselves. One of the most common things we hear is, man, it would be nice if we had a contract management system that let us know a few months in advance when something like a contract was about to expire. In this case, let's look at that from the perspective of SOPs that need to be periodically reviewed and updated for a company. So, the absolute easiest way that you can start getting some value out of Power Automate is going to be to go to one of these libraries where you have some of that data you want to be notified about. Just hit these three dots up here at kind of the top middle of the page. What you'll find in here is we have a couple of menus, right? We have Automate and we have Integrate. Let's focus on Automate for now. So this Automate menu lets us actually leverage some of those automation capabilities of the platform. In this case, I'll say let's set a reminder for this SOP expires on, right? That's a column that you see here tracking some of these dates. If I just click on that, we'll wait for this to load. It can take just a quick second, but it's really spending this time thinking about what that flow is that it should make because we're trying to get a reminder on a certain column. So this menu might not look familiar to all of you, but this is kind of Power Automate or Flow really trying to tell us all of the services that it's going to use for this automation that it's creating, right? It gives us a brief description of the workflow that it's making, and it tells us, hey, I'm going to need access to SharePoint. I'm going to need access to an app called Notifications, where it can actually let you know about the app that it's or workflow that it's putting together for you. And it's going to need access to this service called Office 365 Users, where it can read information about you as a user, figure out your email or other things that might be relevant to that notification. So if I just say continue, it'll ask me a couple of basic questions here about how I want this particular flow to be stood up. It'll tell me I can give it a flow name. In this case, we'll say get an email reminder works, but let's also tell it a little more specifics about SOPs. And it asks us how far in advance do we want it to notify us when an SOP is about to expire. Maybe I'll say, just let me know 5 days before that expiration happens. And I'll click create. And what that's doing for me is it's actually making a workflow in Power Automate, right? So let me take you over there so we can just see exactly what that put together for me.
And I think it's also important to say at that point, a user, so someone who's just starting out in this, an end user, really would just stop at that point. And then they would see, they'd expect the email to come to them in a couple of days. But someone who wants to get a little bit more involved in it or go see what happened behind the scenes would then really want to come to here where Tavon's going to Power Automate to be able to take a look at what it's actually doing behind the scenes. Even if you didn't change anything, I think it's still a good step for even a beginner to just go to Power Automate, take a look at, did it create something in the background for me instead of having to sit there and wait for that email in 5 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at this screen that you'll have in front of you now, what we're looking at here is the Power Automate Designer, right? This is the workflow designing experience where we can actually see what one of those flows is or customize it. So just by clicking those couple of buttons in SharePoint, it put together this entire workflow for me. It figured out that it should have a trigger type of recurrence. We'll talk more about that later, but it just means this will run every day at about 3 o'clock. It was kind enough to initialize a variable that it's going to use to build a table and notify me in a nice, visually pleasing way about all of those SOPs expiring in 5 days. And notice right here that it gave us a place that we can actually change the days to remind me in very easily. So maybe when I first set up this workflow, I thought 5 days was good enough. But maybe I'm using it a little bit more heavily, and all of a sudden I want that to be 15 days in advance. It notifies me. Just by changing this one value, I've gone ahead and actually updated the amount of time out in advance that it'll notify me. And some of these things you're seeing here are actually best practices for building a flow, right? We'll talk more about that later on, but it was very intelligent of Microsoft to put this right here this days to remind me, rather than making us actually dig through everything else that the flow is doing to update that value. All right. So it also has in here another best practice we'll talk about a bit later on, where it actually tries to let us know if anything had gone wrong throughout the execution of this flow run. And we can take a closer look at that functionality later on as well. But again, this is a well-built flow that we didn't have to do anything to get stood up other than just click a couple of buttons.